My name is Peter Miller. I have 51 years old, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. For 18 years, I was married to an admirable woman, dedicated and faithful to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Everyone saw her as a model of virtue. She was the secretary of a respected bishop, someone in whom even I had complete trust. He served enthusiastically, organized meetings, kept ward records, and seemed to live entirely for his faith. For nearly 2 decades, I believed I knew every detail of her soul, her fears, her hopes, her dreams. But there was something she never told me, a secret hidden beneath her prayers, her meetings, and her appearances. A silence that only broke when it became impossible to pretend nothing was happening. Today, after everything I've been through, I decided to tell this story, not to condemn, but to understand how faith can become a prison when used to hide the truth. Comment your city and country so I know how far my voice is reaching. Leave your like if you believe that faith should never be used to hide the truth, and subscribe for more real stories. From the beginning, everyone saw Sarah like a chosen woman. She was the kind of person who lit up any room she entered. Her soft voice seemed to have the gift of calming even the most restless hearts, and her smile conveyed an almost divine serenity. To the members of the church, she was a living example of what it meant to be a woman of God. She was always present at Sunday services, charity events, relief meetings, and of course, at the bishop's side, in every detail of the ward's administration. Sarah, she was the perfect secretary, organized, disciplined, and loyal. She kept records, answered phone calls, prepared guest lists, filed reports, and kept the ward temple in order with the same dedication she cared for her own home. I remember the late nights she'd sit at her desk, reviewing papers and notes. I'd say, "You work too hard, honey, get some rest." And she'd respond, with that sweet smile, "Peter, it's the Lord's work. I can't fail." Her brothers respected her, her sisters admired her, and the young women saw her as a role model. It was impossible not to be proud of having such a wife. Sometimes the bishop himself would mention her name in meetings, praising her exemplary consecration and her unwavering spirituality. And when this happened, I felt a lump in my throat, a mixture of love and gratitude. I sincerely believed that God had blessed me with the most virtuous woman in the world. Our life revolved around the church. Every night before bed, we prayed together. She always prayed for the leaders, the missionaries, and even for me, asking God that I would continue to be a husband worthy of the priesthood. On Sundays, she woke before everyone else to prepare the clothes, iron the white shirts, and get everything ready for worship. It was a sacred routine. Nothing seemed out of place. Over time, I realized that her devotion went beyond the ordinary. There was something in her gaze when she spoke of the bishop, a mixture of respect and fear, a reverence that went beyond the spiritual. I didn't see any malice in it. In my mind, it was simply a reflection of the deep faith she had always carried. I used to tell myself, Sarah is incapable of lying. She is incapable of disobeying God. In the community, she was practically a living legend. People would say, if all women were like her, the world would be a purer place. And I believed it because what I saw at home exactly matched everyone's image of her. The same smile, the same kind words, the same unwavering zeal. Everything about her seemed so genuine, so perfect, so divine. The days passed between religious commitments and administrative meetings. She wrote down every detail, every decision, every confidence the bishop confided in her. I never asked anything, not out of disinterest, but out of respect. It was as if I, too, believed that, regarding certain things, only the chosen should know. Today I realize how much this thought blinded me. At that time, however, life seemed stable. The marriage was harmonious. Our faith was the foundation, and everything revolved around the church. There was no room for doubt, nor for shadows. I believed that the more we served, the closer we would be to God, and my wife was living proof of this. She didn't just believe, she lived this belief in every gesture, every word, every look. I remember one particular night as we were driving back from a stake conference. In the car, She took my hand and said, "Peter, do you feel the Spirit when the bishop speaks?" I said yes, but what I really felt was her love for that environment, for that system she held sacred. She smiled and added, "I would give my life not to disappoint the Lord." At that moment, something deep inside me was moved. I saw in her purity, devotion, and a strength I myself lacked. I believed that God had entrusted me with an extraordinary woman, someone whose faith sustained not only her family, but her community itself, and it was like that for many years. I never suspected anything. I never imagined that behind that serene expression, there was something she was hiding even from herself. For me, Sarah was untouchable, incorruptible, invincible. But looking back, I realize how faith, when mixed with blind obedience, can turn angels into prisoners. She served the church so much that she forgot to serve herself. She dedicated herself so much to others that she began to disappear within her own goodness. And me? I just watched, proud, thinking I lived next to a saint. I never imagined that that same glow of faith would one day become the reflection of a secret. I believed that nothing could corrupt someone so close to God, living within. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was like living within a carefully designed structure, perfect on the outside, unshakable on the inside. Every detail had an order, every person a role, every thought a limit. Everything was supervised, everything was recorded, everything had to be in accordance with the Spirit. To those who grew up within it, the system didn't feel like control. It felt like love, it felt like divine discipline. But today, looking back, I see how that world operated with a precision that left no room to breathe. The hierarchy was as clear as the temple glass. At the top, the prophet, the voice of God on earth. Below him, the apostles, the 70s. The stake presidents, the bishops, and finally us, the rank-and-file members. Every decision, even the simplest, had to follow this invisible but relentless chain of command. And my wife, Sarah, was right in the middle of this machinery. As a bishop's secretary, she was the silent link between power and the people. She knew everything. The confidential meetings, the confessions members made seeking forgiveness, the decisions about who would be called to serve or removed for unworthiness. She was the one who recorded everything, dates, names, sins, blessings. She kept secrets no one else was supposed to know. Sometimes I would joke, "You must know more about people's lives than God himself." She smiled but didn't respond. There was something in that silence I didn't understand, a heaviness that clashed with the usual brilliance of her faith. Her routine was exhausting. Monday was planning day with the bishop. Tuesday, follow-up visits. Wednesday, choir rehearsals. Thursday, meetings with women's organization leaders. Friday, financial reports and review of membership records. On Saturday, she helped with youth classes. And on Sunday, the entire day was dedicated to worship, teaching, and adoration. I saw my wife every day, but at the same time, I felt she was increasingly distant. Even when we were together, it felt like part of her was still inside the church, as if her mind never left the chapel walls. At night, she would sit at the table, look through the bishopric papers, and jot something down in her black notebook, the same one she never let me see. When I asked what it was, she would say, "Church stuff, Peter. I can't comment." At first, I accepted this as a sign of her responsibility. But as the months passed, the secret began to bother me. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, and sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, as if she had nightmares. I would ask if everything was okay, and she would simply reply, "I'm fine. It's just tiredness." But her look said otherwise. There was something different about her. The smile was still there, but it no longer held the same sparkle. Her prayers became longer, more tense. And every now and then, she would cry alone in the bathroom, thinking I couldn't see. Once, I heard her murmur the bishop's name while praying, as if asking for forgiveness for something. When I asked, she turned pale and answered too quickly. "I was interceding for him, Peter. He carries a lot of weight." That's when I began to notice other things. The bishop would frequently call our house after hours, always with some urgent matter. Sometimes she would go out at night to help with confidential documents or visit a sister in need. I wanted to trust her, and I did. After all, she was the most faithful woman I knew. But a quiet restlessness began to grow within me, something I tried to ignore in the name of faith. The Mormon community left no room for questioning. Everything was interpreted as a spiritual test. If I felt doubt, it was because the adversary was trying to pull me away from the light. So I prayed more, fasted, and sought the Spirit. I asked God to give me peace, but peace didn't come. On the contrary, the silence seemed to deepen. Little by little, our relationship began to change. Conversations became short, laughter less frequent. When I tried to get closer, she withdrew. "I'm tired, Peter. That's all." But I sensed there was more. She seemed to carry the weight of something unsaid. The love that had once been filled with faith was now filled with distance. Within the church, everyone continued to admire her. The sisters praised her sweetness, the leaders extolled her loyalty, and the bishop made a point of highlighting her exemplary dedication at every meeting. It was as if everyone saw a version of her that no longer existed, or that existed only for them. At home, silence reigned. One night she arrived late, her face drawn, her eyes lost. She said she was reviewing reports with the bishop. I tried to joke, saying, "You must be writing the new Book of Mormon." She didn't laugh. She just set the papers on the table and said, "You don't understand, Peter. There are things that need to be kept secret for the good of the church." That phrase echoed in my mind for weeks. For the good of the church. It felt rehearsed, learned, as if she didn't speak for herself. I wanted to believe it, but part of me knew, when a faith demands so much silence, it's because it's hiding something. From that moment on, the distance between us was no longer just emotional, it became spiritual. The home that once breathed prayers and songs became dense, heavy, and even sleeping next to her, I already felt alone. I saw my wife every day, but I felt like she was getting further and further away. At home, the atmosphere began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a shadow creeping noiselessly across the walls. Sarah, the woman who always sang hymns while preparing dinner, now cooked in silence. The hymns were gone, as were the spontaneous conversations, the late-night laughter, and the long family prayers that once brought us together. There was a new kind of stillness between us, not the spiritual peace we used to feel, but a dense emptiness, made of distance and unspoken words. She said it was just weariness from serving the Lord. "The meetings have been long, Peter. The bishop has needed me more than ever." But I knew. There was something different in that look. The gleam of faith that had once shone in her eyes had been replaced by a weight hard to describe, the weight of guilt, perhaps, or the weight of a secret slowly consuming her. At the table, she ate little and spoke less. She ran her fingers over the rim of her plate, lost in thought. When I tried to make conversation, she looked away. "Everything okay, love?" I asked. She replied, emotionless, "Everything is in God's hands." But there was a tension in her voice, as if she were reciting a memorized phrase. One night, I summoned the courage to ask what was going on. "Sarah, what's going on between you and the bishop? I've noticed something has changed." She stood still for a few seconds, her fork poised in midair, and then smiled slightly. A cold, almost mechanical smile. "Peter, don't be unfair. You know everything I do is to serve the Lord." I tried to insist, but she just placed her hand on the Bible and said, "Pray more. When God wants, He will show you what you need to know." These words, spoken with apparent serenity, cut me to the core. It was as if I had been demoted from the position of husband to that of a believer seeking revelation. The woman who had once looked at me with love now spoke to me as one might speak to a distant disciple. The days became predictable, suffocating. She would wake up early, leave for church activities, and return late, almost always exhausted. Sometimes she would take a shower and stay there for long minutes, silent, as if the water could wash away something her heart couldn't erase. Other times, she would sit on the couch, open the Book of Mormon, and read compulsively, like someone trying to convince herself of a faith she no longer finds. The home that once smelled of warm bread and serenity now felt cold and impersonal. I would come home from work to find the house perfectly tidy, but lifeless. The furniture was in place, the curtains neatly ironed, the pictures with verses lined the walls, but the love that gave meaning to everything was gone. Once, during dinner, I asked if we could take a trip, get away from the routine for a bit. She replied without looking up, "The bishop needs me this week, and the Lord put me here for a purpose, Peter. Not everything needs to be said. Just trust." That hit me harder than any shout. It was as if each sentence she spoke was accompanied by a wall, an invisible boundary that prevented me from getting closer. As the months passed, her silence began to change me too. I found myself trying to decipher gestures, interpret looks, and search for answers between the lines. And the more I tried to understand, the more distant she became. I prayed every night for wisdom. I asked God to show me what was wrong, but it seemed as if heaven itself had adopted her same silence. One morning, I woke up and realized she wasn't beside me. The office light was on. I walked over and found her sitting at her desk, her eyes red, staring intently at a piece of paper. When she saw me, she quickly put it in a folder and said, "Go to sleep, Peter. It's nothing." I tried to insist, but she just repeated, "Pray. God knows what He's doing." In that moment, I realized I had lost the right to truth within my own home. Everything that had once been shared, the plans, the decisions, the pain, was now hidden behind pious expressions and phrases that seemed to come from a faith manual. She no longer spoke like my wife. She spoke like a missionary, trying to convert me to blind obedience. Sundays were the worst. I watched her in church, radiant, smiling, surrounded by sisters and leaders who praised her. "Sister Sarah is a model of virtue," they said. "The bishop is lucky to have her as his secretary." And I, sitting in the pew, feigned pride. But inside me, something was breaking, because I saw the difference, the stark contrast between the public woman, full of light, and the private wife, plunged into the darkness of silence. Sometimes I wondered if she still loved me. Other times, if she still loved herself. But every attempt at dialogue died the same way, with a verse, a prayer, a cliché. "The Lord is in control. Don't listen to doubt. Everything that happens is for our spiritual growth." These were beautiful words, but empty. And the more she talked about God, the more I felt our home was being taken over by something that didn't come from Him. It was as if the faith that once united us now served as a barrier between us. She hid behind it, and I, out of love, accepted it. Until love, too, began to grow weary. The silence, which once seemed like piety, became a prison. I began to dread the sound of the key in the door, knowing that upon entering, she would bring with her that same cold air, that same invisible weight. At night, as I lay down to bed, I would hear her sigh in the darkness, as if carrying a burden impossible to share. And deep down, I already knew, whatever was destroying our peace came from within, not from our home, but from the church she served so devotedly. I have learned that silence is sometimes the cruelest disguise of faith. As the months passed, the strangeness I had previously tried to ignore began to become impossible to hide. Sarah, she wasn't the same anymore. And it wasn't just fatigue or emotional distance. There was something concrete, something hidden, moving beneath the calm surface she tried to maintain. The small details began to accumulate, forming a mosaic of doubts that I didn't want to piece together, but that reality itself insisted on showing me. It all started with the phone calls. Before, she would answer the phone in front of me, smiling, chatting about church activities, sisters' visits, or ward events. Now she answered too quickly, spoke softly, and walked away to another room. When I asked who it was, she would respond with rehearsed ease, "The bishop. We're just adjusting the calendar." However, something didn't feel right. The conversations were too long for simple adjustments. One day, while she was taking a shower, her phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from the bishop. The screen showed only part of the text. "We need to talk in person about what happened yesterday." My heart raced. I stared at that short sentence, trying to give it some innocent meaning, but I couldn't. By the time she came out of the bathroom, she had already deleted the message. I remained silent, but something inside me began to break. The nights became filled with excuses. "I have a special meeting with the bishop. We need to review some confidential reports. A Relief Society sister is going through a difficult time. They were always pious, spiritual, irrefutable excuses, and wanting to believe them, I let her go. However, the hours became too long. Sometimes she would return late, with red eyes and a drawn expression. She would simply say, "Pray for us, Peter. The enemy is trying to confuse the church." I tried to convince her to take some time off, to rest, to slow down. She reacted with a coldness I'd never seen before. "You don't understand, Peter. When God calls, we obey, even when we're tired." And in that moment, I realized there was no longer any space for me between her and the institution. The church had become the center of our home, and the bishop, the name that echoed in every silence. Things got worse when I started noticing her deleting her call and message history. She'd never done that before. At first, I thought it was an oversight, but I soon realized the pattern. Every time I entered the room, she quickly locked her phone screen. One night, while she was sleeping, her phone vibrated. I carefully picked it up and saw the notification disappear before I could read it. Only the name Bishop Allen. That name began to haunt me. I tried to convince myself it was just jealousy, that I was seeing things where there was nothing. After all, the bishop was a man of God, married, respected, admired by all. It was unthinkable, or at least it should have been. But the more I tried to suppress the instinct, the more it grew. I vividly remember the night everything changed. We were in the living room, and she was talking on the phone. Her voice was tense, low, almost whispered. I was in the kitchen and only heard fragments. "Yes, I understand. No, he doesn't know. Of course, no one will find out ... double quotes. The next sentence made me freeze. "I promise, no one will know what was." Disgust. She ended the call quickly when she realized I was close. She smiled, but it was late, forced. "It was the bishop," she said, as always. "An administrative problem." I just nodded, trying to remain calm. But something inside me had already shifted. That phrase, "no one will know what was discussed," remained echoing in my mind like a disguised confession. From that moment on, I began to observe more closely. The way she avoided looking me in the eye, the way she clutched her cell phone to her chest when the bishop called, her increasingly vague excuses, and above all, the fear. There was fear in her, fear of being caught, fear of losing whatever she was trying to hide, and perhaps fear of herself. At church meetings, I'd see her sitting next to the bishop, taking notes with that serene expression everyone admired. Sometimes their glances would last a second longer than necessary. Small, discreet gestures. But for those who know love and lies, a second is enough to understand everything. At home, the silence became a minefield. I no longer knew what I could or couldn't say. Any attempt at dialogue turned into a sermon. "Peter, the enemy wants to divide us. Trust in God." Or, "This is not the time to doubt. It's the time to strengthen your faith." These phrases, spoken in a calm, gentle voice, served as spiritual walls to keep me from the truth. But the more she asked me to trust, the more I became suspicious. Because trust isn't the same as blindness, and faith isn't the same as submission. I began to realize that, within the church, people were confusing obedience with holiness. And it was precisely this confusion that began to destroy my home. One Sunday, after church, the bishop took me aside. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Peter, remember, there are things servants of the Lord don't need to understand. Sometimes it's better not to know." He smiled with the calm of someone who has the power to manipulate consciences and left, leaving me with my heart in pieces. That night I lay awake, watching my wife sleep. Her face seemed peaceful, but there was something strange about it, as if even in sleep she wore a mask. I wanted to believe it was all just a misunderstanding, but deep down, I already knew. When faith demands silence, it's because something cannot bear the light. It was at that moment that I realized blind trust is the first step to the abyss. The truth came like a blow, not swiftly but slowly, like a wound that slowly opens until the pain becomes unbearable. For months, I lived trapped between faith and doubt, between love and distrust. But no prayer, no fasting, no attempt to convince myself could silence what my heart already knew. Something was terribly wrong. And as with all well-disguised lies, the truth finally found a way to emerge. It all began on a seemingly ordinary morning. Sarah had left early for a special meeting with the bishop. I was at home, trying to concentrate on work, when the landline rang. It was the bishop's wife. Her voice trembled. "Peter, the bishop isn't in the chapel. They said he's gone, but no one knows where." At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I felt instinct pushing me out of the house, into the car, onto the road. I drove without thinking, guided only by a terrible certainty I didn't want to admit. Sarah's car was parked near a simple house on the outskirts of town, a house that didn't belong to any member I knew. I waited. The minutes felt like hours, until I saw the door open. She came out first, her eyes red, her hair hastily tied up. Right behind her, the bishop. They paused at the door, exchanged a few words, and she lowered her head. The bishop placed his hand on her shoulder, and for a second, time stood still. That gesture, that touch, said more than any sermon I had ever heard. I don't remember exactly how I got home. I only remember the feeling of the world collapsing around me. I sat in the living room, staring into space, waiting for her to return. When the door opened, I didn't say a word. She looked at me pale, as if she already knew I knew. She was silent for a few seconds, then began to cry. "Peter, please, listen to me." Her voice was a shaky whisper. I couldn't answer. She knelt in front of me, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing God's will." Those words were like knives. "God's will?" I repeated in disbelief. "What are you saying, Sarah?" She brought her hands to her face and broke down. "He told me the Spirit had revealed to me that I was special, that I had a sacred role in his life. He said he needed my faith, my body, my silence." I resisted, Peter. I swear I resisted. But he said that if I didn't accept, I would be disobeying the voice of the Lord. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The air grew heavy, difficult to breathe. It was as if all the certainties that had sustained my life had shattered at once. The man I respected, the spiritual leader we called servant of the Most High, had transformed into something monstrous, and my wife, the woman I loved, had become a prisoner of his manipulation. She continued, her voice breaking. "I wanted to tell him, but I was afraid. He said God had chosen him to guide me, and that revealing what was happening would destroy the Lord's work." I felt dirty, guilty, lost. And the more I served in the church, the more I tried to make up for what he did to me. Each word she said struck me like an invisible blow. Anger, disgust, compassion, and despair mingled within me. I wanted to scream, to break everything, but at the same time, a part of me could only feel sorry for her, for the woman who believed that abuse could be faith, that sin could come disguised as revelation. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me?" She took a deep breath, sobbing. "Because he made me believe you wouldn't understand. He said that ordinary men don't understand divine callings, that if I opened my mouth, you would be punished for doubting a prophet." I fell silent. Every memory began to reconfigure itself inside my mind. The sleepless nights, the deleted messages, the prayers that went too long, the looks between them. Everything clicked into place now, cruelly and inevitably. In that moment, the faith that had sustained me collapsed. Not faith in God, but faith in the church, in its leaders, in the structure I believed to be sacred. I realized that the obedience they demanded wasn't spiritual, it was emotional. It was power over guilt and fear. She wept, saying, "I only wanted to serve. I thought I was being chosen. I didn't realize I was being used." And I, powerless to console her, just closed my eyes. I saw before me not the woman who betrayed me, but the woman who was betrayed by a distorted faith. In the following days, silence once again dominated the house. But this time it was a different silence, a silence filled with suppressed screams. She tried to explain, asked for forgiveness, said she wanted to make amends. But nothing she said could erase the image of the bishop touching her shoulder at the door of that house. I went to the stake leadership. I wanted to report it. But what I found was the same familiar wall. "Peter, pray and trust." Don't tarnish the name of the church because of human weakness. Another leader said, you don't understand the Lord's plans. Sometimes he tests our faith with difficult situations. It was as if everyone was blind, as if evil within the church needed to be protected under the cloak of holiness. It was then that I understood something that would forever change my way of seeing the sacred. Not everything done in God's name comes from God. Evil can wear white robes, use the title of bishop, speak with a soft voice, and still destroy souls with the weight of spiritual authority. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my sleeping wife, her face weary, her body hunched with remorse. I loved her, but I no longer knew who she was. The faith that had once united us was now what tore us apart. I closed my eyes and murmured a short, almost faithless prayer. Lord, if your name has been used to hurt, then teach me to recognize your voice amidst the lies. And in that heavy silence, a truth formed within me. That day I understood that even the holiest altars can hide shadows. The day after Sarah's confession, I woke with my heart on fire. I had barely slept. I spent the night silently repeating every word she had said, trying to understand where faith had gone astray, where the lie had begun. The sun had barely risen when I decided to do what I considered right, confront the man who had used God's name to destroy my family. I didn't want scandal. I didn't want revenge. I wanted only the truth. I drove to the main chapel. The parking lot was empty, except for a silver car I recognized from afar, the bishop's car. I entered unannounced and found him in his office, writing something in a notebook. When he saw me, he gave me a mechanical smile. Peter, I didn't expect to see you so soon. Is everything okay with Sarah? His voice was too calm, and it infuriated me. Don't pretend. I know everything. The smile faded. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. Everything. What? Of what you did to my wife. Of what you said to her in the name of God. Of what you destroyed inside our home. There was a long silence. Clock on the wall ticked away as if mocking me. He didn't seem surprised, just tired, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Peter, he said finally, his voice low and measured, be careful what you say. The enemy is cunning. He uses pain to sow doubt. You are wounded, and when the heart opens wide, Satan finds a way. Those words pierced me like blades. Don't you dare bring the devil between us, Bishop. That wasn't temptation, it was abuse. It was manipulation. He stood up slowly, approaching me with that hypocritical serenity only false saints can feign. You're misinterpreting. Everything I did was inspired. Your wife is a woman sensitive to the Spirit. Sometimes the Lord allows us to draw closer to fulfill purposes the human mind cannot comprehend. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He spoke of destruction as if it were revelation. I looked around, trying to understand if this was real. Are you saying God told you to do this? He smiled faintly. Do not judge spiritual things with carnal eyes. I left before I lost control. The door slammed shut behind me, echoing through the empty hallway. My hands trembled, the floor seemed to spin, and for the first time in 20 years of faith, I felt fear inside God's house. But fear turned to anger. I returned the next day, this time to speak with the stake president, the leader above the bishop. I waited nearly an hour in the anteroom, my heart pounding in my chest. When I was finally admitted, he listened to me in silence, his face impenetrable, emotionless. When I finished, he stood up and said, Peter, I know you. I know you're a good man, but these are serious accusations. The bishop is a servant of the Lord, and to doubt a servant is to doubt Christ himself. So the Lord approves of what he did? I asked, almost shouting. He sighed, and in a fatherly tone replied, That's not how it works. Sometimes the Spirit allows us to be tested. The enemy uses human emotions to destroy the work. Pray. And, above all, don't talk about it to anyone. Not talk about it? I repeated, incredulous. If you spread rumors, you will be considered apostasy. And you know what that means, don't you? The threat was sweetly delivered, but the venom was there clear, cold, and direct. Apostasy, the word every Mormon dreads. To be called, that is to be exiled from the community, to lose friends, to be seen as someone in the hands of the devil. I left feeling the weight of a world crumbling around me. I tried to seek comfort from friends at church, brothers and sisters from long years of service. I sent messages, tried to schedule conversations. No one responded. Some just looked. Others changed sides when they saw me. On Sunday, I went to chapel for the last time. Everyone looked at me differently, looks of pity, judgment, fear. I had become the invisible enemy, the man who dared question the Lord's anointed. Sarah beside me kept her eyes downcast, her hands trembling. After the sacrament, the key bishop's new counselor approached me. "Peter, the leadership has asked you to step away for a while, to reflect, to heal. The Lord works in silence. The Lord works in silence." That phrase echoed with cruel irony, because silence was precisely what allowed men like that bishop to go unpunished. In the weeks that followed, solitude became my new cult. No calls, no visits. People who once called me brother now looked away. Sarah lived between regret and fear. "They said if we speak, the Spirit will leave us," she whispered one night weeping. "What if the Spirit has already left, Sarah?" I replied wearily. "What if what we call the Spirit was just their voice?" I went to the regional headquarters, sent letters, and reported everything: the meetings, the manipulations, the messages. I received only a cold response. "The case has been analyzed. No action will be necessary. Trust in the Lord's justice." Justice. That word lost all meaning. The bishop remained in office. He continued, preaching about purity, obedience, and forgiveness. And every time I saw him in the pulpit, speaking about the light of Christ, I felt like screaming, but I didn't scream, because I knew no one would hear. In church, the sound of doubt is drowned out by hymns and smiles. Evil disguises itself as devotion, and truth is labeled apostasy. I simply withdrew, taking with me what was left of my faith, a wounded faith, stripped of illusions, but still alive enough to keep me from hating. While I sought the truth, they prayed for me to be silent. The months that followed the confrontation were a desert of silence and pain. The house that had once been filled with laughter, hymns, and prayers became an empty space, suffocated by memories. Sarah no longer smiled. She spent her mornings staring into space, her eyes puffy, her voice constantly trembling. Sometimes I heard her whispering prayers for forgiveness, as if the very air were a tribunal. "Lord, forgive me. I didn't mean to ... she would say between sobs. And I, standing at the door, unable to interrupt, felt a mixture of compassion and despair. She began to wither. She slept little, ate less. Any noise made her jump. When the phone rang, she trembled, as if expecting a new condemnation. "They said they're going to excommunicate me, Peter," she murmured. "They said I was tarnishing the name of the church." I tried to console her, but my own faith had already been shattered. How could I say trust in God when everything we'd been taught about Him had been used to hurt us? I also fell ill, but with a different kind of pain, the kind you can't see. I woke in the early hours of the morning with my heart racing, my body in a cold sweat. I dreamed of the bishop, of the meetings, of the voices telling me to be silent. I felt anger and guilt in equal measure. Anger at him, guilt for not having protected Sarah. Every Sunday, the distant sound of the chapel bells seemed to mock me. That sound, which had once brought me peace, was now a reminder of a spiritual captivity. The bills began to pile up. Sarah could no longer work, and I had been removed from the church's business circle. No one wanted to deal with me anymore. "He's bitter," they said. "He's being used by the enemy." People who called me brother crossed the street to avoid my gaze. Friends' children, who once played in our yard, were now forbidden to come. It was during this isolation that I began to rethink everything I believed. I picked up the scriptures and reread each page, not as a believer seeking answers, but as a man trying to decipher what was left of his own soul. And I realized something painful I had never thought for myself. Every choice, every step, every word spoken in prayer had been shaped by the church, by its leaders, by dogma. My faith was never free. It was conditioned, monitored, manipulated. One night, Sarah woke up in tears. "Peter, I can't take it anymore." I want to disappear. I ran to hug her. She was shaking like a child. They said God turned his back on me, she cried. And in that moment, I understood that if I stayed there, we would lose more than our marriage, we would lose our sanity. It was then that I decided I had to leave. Not to escape, but to survive. The next day, I put on my best suit, the same one I wore to church conferences, and went to the stake building. I handed in my letter of renunciation of the Mormon faith. The clerk looked at me in astonishment. Are you sure? He asked. This is formal apostasy. I do, I replied firmly, because I can't keep calling light what lives in the shadows. He tried to argue, citing prophets, scriptures, promises of eternal blessings, but nothing held my attention. This man spoke as if repeating a memorized script, and I already knew the ending, an ending that always favored the powerful and silenced the wounded. As I left the building, the cold wind blew against my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was breathing fresh air. There was pain, yes, but there was also freedom. The weight of guilt, of blind obedience, of spiritual submission began to dissolve. I knew the journey from then on would be lonely, but at least it would be mine. At home, I told Sarah. She cried, but not in despair. It was a different kind of crying, as if she could finally let out the breath she'd been holding for years. You did what I didn't have the courage to do, she said weakly. Maybe now God can hear us without intermediaries. Little by little, she began to rebuild herself. She abandoned her job, her commitments, her meetings. She began painting, something she hadn't done since she was young. Sometimes we would sit in silence for hours, just watching the sunset from the balcony. Neither of us needed to pretend to be saints anymore, but the scar remained. There were days when the memory came back with a vengeance. The bishop's face, his words, the broken promises. And yet, something within me began to blossom, a new, simple, human faith. A faith that didn't depend on temples, leaders, or titles. I discovered that God doesn't dwell in white-towered buildings, but in sincere repentance, in compassion, in telling the truth even when it hurts. I understood that love doesn't demand submission, and that faith, when true, liberates, never imprisons. One autumn afternoon, walking with Sarah through the park, she took my hand and said, "You know, Peter, maybe all this happened so we could finally know the true God." I just smiled. There was no need to argue theology anymore. The silence this time was peace. That night I wrote the last lines of my diary. I didn't leave the church out of hatred. I left because love couldn't breathe within. I didn't want revenge, I wanted peace. And I realized that peace doesn't arise where truth is forbidden. It was at this point that I understood definitively what had taken me decades to learn. Faith is not the property of any institution, nor does it need prophets to exist. It was necessary to lose faith in the institution to find faith in God again. The healing didn't begin with a miracle. It began with a small gesture, opening the windows of my house on a cold morning and letting the air in. The smell of damp paper, of stored clothes, and of sleepless nights slowly dissipated, as if the wind itself knew there were wounds there that needed to breathe. Me and Sarah, we spent weeks not knowing exactly what to say to each other. There were too many words jammed together, and yet, at the same time, no word seemed enough. We discovered then that silence, when not imposed, can also be healing. We would sit on the porch, watching the sky change colors, and this simple exercise of existing without masks was the first true prayer we had said in a long time. I was angry at the bishop, angry at the structure that protected him, angry at myself for not realizing it sooner. For days, I wrote letters I never sent. I drafted complaints, speeches and outbursts that ended up crumpled in the trash. I realized that anger wanted to transform me into the very thing I fought against, a man who speaks loudly to impose himself, not to heal. So I started walking. Every afternoon, slowly, I crossed the neighborhood, feeling my body grow weary and my mind empty. When I returned, I could hear Sarah without interrupting, without explaining, without justifying. That's when I understood. Truly listening is a spiritual act. She too began her own journey of healing. First, she put away her diaries, reports, membership cards, everything that tied her to a bleeding past. Then she returned to painting. With each canvas, he seemed to reclaim a piece of himself. I saw her focused, paint stains on her fingers, the serene look I hadn't seen in years. One day, he called me to look at a new painting. An open field, no temple, no tower, no wall, just a long illuminated horizon. I wanted to paint a place where God would fit completely. He sighed, smiling with shy sweetness. There I realized we were rediscovering a faith without fences. Learning to separate agati eshelijo wasn't simple. Every time a memory from the past surfaced, it was accompanied by guilt. I found myself avoiding words like blessing, revelation, priesthood, as if language had been hijacked and certain syllables were dangerous to pronounce. Gradually, however, I reclaimed the vocabulary of the sacred for a more human place. Blessing became bread shared with a neighbor. Revelation became the moment when a look tells the truth. Priesthood ceased to be power and became service. I began to perceive God in the details I previously dismissed as not up to standard. In a laugh for no reason. In a song that plays randomly, in the long embrace of reconciliation. There were relapses. Some Sundays, I woke up wanting to put on my white shirt and go to chapel, like someone who runs back to an old habit in the hope of numbing the pain. I and Sarah, we talked, and the longing passed. It wasn't nostalgia for worship, it was longing for community, for belonging. So we made a decision. We would build a small community of 2. We cooked more, invited people hurting like us to dinner, and listened to stories that religion couldn't accommodate. I understood something that should have been obvious. Faith that isolates doesn't heal. Faith that shares does. On a specific rainy night, Sarah, she told me something she'd never said before. I felt guilty even for breathing Peter, as if every breath was a betrayal of his authority. I didn't just cry for you. I cried for myself, for believing that God needed my silence to continue being God. I hugged her, without a response. We cried together. It was a different kind of cry, not the cry of despair, but the cry of cleansing. Then, quietly, I managed to formulate the sentence that freed me. Today, I understand that what destroyed our lives was not God. It was fear that used his name. Saying it out loud was like unlocking an ancient door. I started therapy. It took me time to accept that, even though I hadn't been the direct target of abuse, I was a survivor of a sick spiritual dynamic. I talked about control, about shame, about the trauma that seeps into the simplest gestures. I discovered that forgiveness doesn't begin with the abuser, it begins with me. I forgave myself for not seeing, for not protecting myself better, for choosing the institution over love so many times. It was hard, but with each session I emerged lighter, as if someone were lifting stones from my chest. And what about the bishop? His name still occasionally appeared in town conversations, always accompanied by praise. I had 2 paths. Let his existence define the rest of my story, or allow my story to move forward despite him. I chose the latter, not out of cowardice but out of sanity. What is right will still be said when the time is right, to the right people. Haste, I learned, can be the sister of revenge. And revenge will never go hand in hand with the peace I seek. Me and Sarah, we create new rituals. On Wednesdays, we walk to a bakery and share a simple sweet treat. On Saturdays, we read aloud a chapter from a book unrelated to religion, novel, poetry, chronicles. On Sundays, instead of the old routine, we cook for someone in need. It's our liturgy of small gestures, our way of remembering that the sacred smells like home and tastes like bread. When memory hurts, we breathe together. Sometimes, Sarah, she still wakes up in the middle of the night, frightened. I hold her hand and repeat, "You are safe. God doesn't need your silence." She closes her eyes and, sometime later, falls asleep. I discovered that this is what love is, staying by someone's side while the other person learns to forgive themselves. I also relearned how to pray. I abandoned formulas, the right words. I talk to God like someone talking to a friend on a park bench. I'm grateful for what I have. I mourn what I've lost. I ask for courage not to become what hurt us. Sometimes I just remain silent. And this silence, unlike the one that oppressed us, gives me back my life. One day, we received a discreet visit from a couple we knew from church. They sat with us, hesitantly, and shared that they were experiencing something similar. I didn't judge, I didn't lecture, I just listened. In the end, they said, "You've given us hope." As they closed the door, Sarah looked at me with gentle tears. "Maybe. That's it, Peter. Maybe our mission now is to transform a wound into a shelter." And I agreed. What was once captivity became an open house. I don't romanticize our history. There are marks that will remain, memories that burn, absences that weigh. But the marks are no longer chains, they've become maps. In them, I read where I shouldn't return, and most importantly, where I can go next. Forgiveness, I've come to understand, doesn't absolve what happened. It interrupts what it could continue to do to me. It's a daily endeavor. Sometimes I move forward, sometimes I regress, and that's okay. Today, when I think about what we experienced, I feel neither pride nor shame. I feel gratitude that we are whole. Sarah laughed again with his whole body. I went back to sleep without fear of the phone ringing. And God stopped being a judge sitting on a pulpit and became a presence in everyday life. A hot coffee, a long hug, a sunset that insists on coloring even the hardest days. If you ask me what remains, I answer without hesitation. The certainty that truth is always the shortest path between pain and peace remains. And that faith, when it is true, does not require us to betray ourselves to be accepted. Forgiving is not forgetting. It is releasing the weight that no longer fits on your chest. The sun was already setting when I realized that chapter of my life had closed. The past still hurt, but it no longer dictated my present. The wound had become a scar visible, but not bleeding. I no longer felt the need to convince anyone, to prove anything, to fight against the shadow of the institution that had nearly destroyed what was most pure in us. What remained was peace. Today, I speak not out of revenge, but out of love. Love for those who still live imprisoned by fear, for those who confuse obedience with faith, for those who believe that God needs mediators to hear their tears. I once believed this too, and it was this blind love disguised as devotion that distanced me from God Himself. I discovered, late, that the Lord does not hide behind pulpits nor speak only through men in suits and ties. He speaks in the silence of conscience, when the soul finally decides to stop lying to itself. I spent years confusing reverence with submission. I thought faith meant bowing my head, accepting everything, remaining silent in the face of error. But true faith is not cowardly. It confronts, it questions, it seeks light where the system tries to keep the curtains closed. And that was the most costly lesson of my life. I lost friends, I lost my reputation, I lost the comfort of belonging. But in losing all that, I gained something no man can take from me, the freedom to think, feel, and believe for myself. Sarah often says that faith is like fire. It warms when free, it destroys when controlled. She's right. For years, we allowed others to fan the flames of our souls, deciding what should burn and what should survive. Now it's different. Today, we fuel our own fire with truth, compassion, and awareness. I no longer frequent stone temples. My temple is the moment. It's the sunrise reflected in a cup of coffee, the embrace of someone who understands without words, the forgiveness born from a simple, "I made mistakes too." It was outside the walls of the church that I found the God I so desperately sought within. He demands neither rituals nor titles. He asks only for honesty. Sometimes someone asks me, "Peter, do you still believe in God?" And I answer without hesitation, more than ever, because now He is not a doctrine, He is a presence. He is in the small daily choices when I decide not to lie, when I choose to listen, when I refuse to repeat the cycle of pain. Faith is no longer an obligation. It has become a breath. I think of the people who are still there, trapped in the web of obedience, believing that to question is to betray. I don't judge them. I was afraid too. Afraid of being rejected, of losing the promised heaven, of discovering that I'd been living deceived. But the truth is that heaven isn't lost when you seek the truth. It reveals itself. And that's what I wish for every soul still living in the shadows, that they find the courage to open their eyes, even if the light hurts at first. Sarah lives in peace today. She plants flowers in her backyard, paints to the sound of old songs, and sometimes laughs at the absurdity of everything we experience. You see, she says, God has always been here. We were just looking the wrong way, and I agree. It took 18 years of silence for us to learn to value the sound of our own voices. If I could summarize everything I learned, I would say this: God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for an awakened conscience. This phrase guides me. It's a reminder that divine love doesn't need fear to sustain itself. Fear builds churches. Awareness builds bridges. The faith that inhabits me now is simple, yet indestructible. It doesn't depend on hierarchies. It doesn't need approval. It doesn't fear judgment. It's the faith of someone who has fallen and risen again, of someone who has lost everything and yet found something greater. Because true faith is not submission, it is freedom. And if my story serves any purpose, let it serve as a mirror. May every person who hears these words know they are not alone, that there is life beyond silence, love beyond guilt, light beyond religion. Comment: I'm awake, I want to know the truth. Leave your like if this story touched you. Subscribe to hear more real stories. And watch the next video, another testimony from someone who also dared to tell the truth. Because the truth, when spoken with love, does not destroy faith, it purifies it. And that's what I believe in now, in the faith that doesn't ask for blindness, but invites us to see.